You've been lied to about the Great Flood. What you learned in Sunday school, what historians told you, what scientists dismissed as myth, they all got it wrong. And the truth, it's way more insane than you think. Because here's the thing nobody wants to talk about, there's actual evidence, real, physical proof that a massive flood changed our world forever. But it's not what you expect. I'm talking about geological layers that shouldn't exist. Ancient cities buried underwater, stories from cultures that never even met each other, all telling the same tale. And scientists, they've been finding stuff that makes this whole thing look less like a fairy tale and more like forgotten history. So let's talk about what really happened, because whether you believe in divine intervention or natural disasters, something definitely went down. And by the end of this, you're going to see the flood story in a completely different light. Let's start with the obvious question. Did a global flood actually happen? And before you roll your eyes, hear me out. Because the answer isn't as simple as yes or no. See, when most people think about the Great Flood, they picture Noah's Ark. Animals marching 2 by 2, rain for 40 days and nights, the whole biblical story. But that's just one version. And here's where it gets weird. Practically every ancient civilization has a flood story. The Mesopotamians had Gilgamesh, the Greeks had Duque, the Hindus had Manu, Native Americans, Aboriginal Australians, ancient Chinese, they all have flood myths. We're talking about over 200 different cultures, spread across every continent, all describing the same catastrophic event, cultures that had zero contact with each other. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. Now, the scientific community spent decades dismissing these stories as pure mythology, just ancient people trying to explain natural disasters they didn't understand. But then something changed. Geologists started finding evidence that didn't fit the narrative. In the 1990s, 2 researchers named William Ryan and Walter Pittman were studying the Black Sea, and they found something absolutely mind-blowing. Around 7,000 years ago, the Black Sea wasn't a sea at all. It was a freshwater lake, sitting way below sea level, separated from the Mediterranean by a natural dam of land. Then that dam broke. Imagine Niagara Falls, but 200 times more powerful. Water from the Mediterranean came crashing through, filling the Black Sea basin at a rate of about 40 cubic miles per day. Coastlines that took generations to settle were underwater in a single day. Entire communities had to flee or drown. The flooding continued for months, maybe even years. By the time it stopped, the Black Sea had risen by hundreds of feet, and thousands of square miles of inhabited land were gone forever, just erased from the map. And here's the kicker. This wasn't some unpopulated wasteland. Archaeological evidence shows this area was home to thriving farming communities. These people had built lives, established villages, developed agriculture. Then one day, the ocean came knocking. Think about what that means. If you were one of those survivors, watching your entire world disappear under rising water, watching your neighbors drown, losing everything you'd ever known, wouldn't you tell that story? Wouldn't you make damn sure your children and grandchildren knew what happened? That's exactly what they did. And as these refugees scattered, fleeing the flood, they carried that story with them. Into Europe, into Asia, into the Middle East. The story evolved, picked up religious elements, got mixed with local beliefs, but the core remained the same, a catastrophic flood that destroyed the world. But the Black Sea flood isn't the only evidence, not even close. Let's talk about something called the Younger Dryas period. About 12,800 years ago, Earth was warming up nicely. The Ice Age was ending. Glaciers were melting. Things were looking good for early humans. Then suddenly, boom, temperatures plummeted. We're talking a drop of 27 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions. And it happened fast, like within a decade. This cold snap lasted for over 1,000 years, and then, just as suddenly, it ended. Temperatures shot back up. Ice sheets that had been stable for centuries started melting at an insane rate. Now here's where it connects to our flood story. When those massive ice sheets melted, where did all that water go? Into the oceans. And we're not talking about a gradual sea level rise like we see today. This was catastrophic. Sea levels jumped by several feet in just a few years in some areas. Coastal communities around the world would have been devastated. Places where humans had lived for generations suddenly became uninhabitable, and it all happened within living memory of multiple generations. Scientists found evidence of massive flooding events from this period all over the planet. In North America, the Missoula floods carved out the Columbia River Gorge. A natural ice dam holding back a lake the size of Lake Ontario suddenly broke, releasing water at a rate 10 times the flow of all the world's rivers combined. The resulting flood moved boulders the size of houses. It created waterfalls that dwarfed Niagara. It reshaped the entire landscape in a matter of days. And similar events happened worldwide. But here's what really messes with your head. What if there wasn't just one great flood? What if there were multiple catastrophic flooding events throughout human history? And all those stories we call myths are actually fragmented memories of different disasters. Because here's what we know for sure. Between 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, sea levels rose by about 400 feet. That's a 40-story building. Entire continental shelves that were once dry land are now underwater, and humans were living on those shelves. Think about where humans naturally settle. River valleys, coastlines, low-lying fertile areas, all the places that would be hit first and worst by rising seas. Archaeological sites that could tell us about these ancient civilizations are now hundreds of feet underwater, covered in sediment, impossible to excavate. We've found a few of them, though. Off the coast of India, sonar has detected the remains of what appears to be a massive city, submerged under 120 feet of water. In the Mediterranean, divers have found entire Neolithic villages preserved underwater. Off Japan, there's an underwater structure that some researchers believe is man-made, dating back over 10,000 years. These aren't myths. These are real places where real people lived, until the water came. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Could there have been a truly global flood, one that covered the entire Earth, including the mountains, like the Bible describes? Science says no. There's just not enough water on the planet. Even if you melted every glacier, every ice cap, every bit of frozen water, sea levels would rise about 230 feet. That's catastrophic for coastal areas, but it wouldn't cover Mount Everest. It wouldn't even come close. But here's the thing. Ancient people didn't know about Mount Everest. Their entire world might have been a river valley or a coastal plain. If water covered every bit of land they'd ever known, every place they'd ever heard of, that would be the entire world to them. Imagine you're a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia. Your whole life exists within a 50-mile radius. You've heard stories about lands beyond the mountains, but you've never seen them. Then a massive flood hits, covering everything you can see, everything you know. Wouldn't you describe that as a flood that covered the whole world? That's probably what happened. Not one global flood, but multiple regional megafloods that were so devastating, so complete in their destruction, that survivors genuinely believed the entire world had drowned. The Black Sea flood, the end of the Younger Dryas, the flooding of the Persian Gulf, the submersion of Sundaland in Southeast Asia, all of these happened during the same general period of human history, the period when we were transitioning from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agricultural societies. This is crucial, because once you settle down, once you build permanent homes and start farming, a flood becomes exponentially more devastating. A nomadic tribe can just move, but farmers have invested everything in their land, their homes, their crops, their livestock, their community infrastructure. All of it gets wiped out. The psychological trauma of that kind of loss would be immense, and it would absolutely become the defining story of that culture. But there's more to this puzzle. Let's talk about something that doesn't get mentioned enough. The flood stories aren't just about destruction. Almost all of them include specific details about how to survive. They're warning stories and instruction manuals rolled into one. Build a boat. Take your family. Bring animals. Stock up on food. Wait for the water to recede. Send out birds to find land. These aren't random elements. These are survival instructions passed down through generations. Think about that for a second. Ancient people knew floods could happen. They'd seen smaller ones, so they encoded instructions for surviving a catastrophic flood into their most important stories. The ones they'd tell around fires, the ones they'd teach to children, the ones that would never be forgotten. That's not mythology. That's practical knowledge disguised as religion, and modern archaeology keeps finding evidence that supports these stories. In Iraq, archaeologists found a layer of sediment at the ancient city of Ur. A layer of pure clay, several feet thick, with no artifacts in it. Below the layer, signs of civilization. Above it, different civilizations. Something had interrupted the continuous occupation of the site. Similar layers have been found at other Mesopotamian sites, always from roughly the same time period, always showing evidence of massive flooding followed by a gap in human habitation. Now, were these all from the same flood? Probably not. Rivers in Mesopotamia flooded regularly, but every few centuries you'd get a really bad one. The kind that destroys everything, the kind that resets civilization. And here's something fascinating. Ancient Mesopotamian texts actually list kings who ruled before the flood and kings who ruled after. They treated it as a historical dividing line. Tis Apened. This was real to them. It wasn't a myth or a metaphor. So where does that leave us? Did the Great Flood happen? Yes. And no. There wasn't one single flood that covered the entire planet, but there were multiple catastrophic flooding events that devastated early human civilizations around the world. Events so traumatic they became embedded in the cultural memory of nearly every society on Earth. The Black Sea flood wiped out thriving communities and scattered refugees across 3 continents. The end of the Ice Age submerged massive coastal areas where humans had lived for thousands of years. Regional megafloods in river valleys destroyed entire civilizations and forced survivors to start over from scratch. These weren't acts of divine punishment. They were the result of natural climate change. Melting glaciers, breaking ice dams, and the chaotic weather patterns that happen when the planet's temperature shifts rapidly. But to the people living through them, the cause didn't matter. What mattered was survival. And they did survive. They rebuilt. They adapted, and they made absolutely certain that future generations would remember what happened. That's what the flood myths really are. They're not fairy tales. They're collective trauma encoded into story form. They're warnings from our ancestors about what nature is capable of. They're evidence that climate catastrophes have happened before and shaped human history in ways we're only beginning to understand. The Arnis were facing similar challenges now: rising sea levels, extreme weather, coastal flooding. Our ancestors survived these things without technology, without science, with nothing but ingenuity and the will to live. And they left us instructions in the form of stories. Maybe it's time we started listening to those stories a bit more carefully. Because the flood didn't just happen in the past. It's still happening. It's always happening. And the real question isn't whether the Great Flood was real. It's whether we're prepared for the next one. If this changed how you think about ancient myths, hit subscribe.